So for today, we will be looking and continuing on in our Genesis series, and we are focusing further on in Genesis chapter 12. Now today we'll be looking at Genesis chapter 12, verse 4. We last Sunday, or 2 Sundays back, we left off at verse 3. And so now we're looking at verse 4 all the way till chapter 13, verse 18. However, for the sake of time and also to give everyone something to do after this, you all can read the full passage on your own. We will reference to specific parts within the sermon, and let us now focus very intensely on verses 7 through the end of the chapter, verse 20 of chapter 12. So I will go ahead and read it. Starting from Genesis chapter 12, verse 7. Then the Lord appeared to Abraham and said, "To your offspring I will give this land." So there he built an altar to the Lord who had appeared to him. From there he moved on to the hill country on the east of Bethel and pitched his tent, with Bethel on the west and Ai on the east. And there he built an altar to the Lord and invoked the name of the Lord. And Abraham journeyed on by stages towards the Negev. And now there was a famine in the land. So Abram went down to Egypt to reside there as an alien, for the famine was severe in the land. When he was about to enter Egypt, he said to his wife Sarai, "I know well that you are a beautiful woman in appearance, and when the Egyptians see you, they will say, 'This is his wife.' Then they will kill me, and they will let you live. So say you are my sister, so that it may go well with me because of you, and that my life may be spared on your account." When Abram entered Egypt, the Egyptians saw that the woman was very beautiful, and the officials of Pharaoh saw her. They praised her to Pharaoh, and the woman was taken into Pharaoh's house. And for her sake, he dealt well with Abram. And he had sheep and oxen, male donkey and female slaves, female donkeys and camels. But the Lord afflicted Pharaoh and his household with great plagues because of Sarai, Abram's wife. So Pharaoh called Abram and said, "What is this that you have done to me? Why did you not tell me that she was your wife? Why did you say she is my sister, so that I took her for my own wife? Now then, here is your wife. Take her and be gone." And Pharaoh gave his men orders concerning him, and they sent him on the way with his wife and with all that he had. So this is the passage that we are going to spend our time meditating on. There's an interesting moment here where, after reaching the land that God had promised to Abram, God states the fact that he is going to bless Abram and he's going to give him many offspring, and this is going to be his land. Abram understood that this is an important pivotal moment in his life, and so he builds an altar and he calls on the name of God. So basically, he builds an altar and he worships God there. Now, what happens after that? This is what we're going to focus on, because once this altar has been built, the next time we see him building an altar is at the end of chapter 13, where there it says that he again builds an altar to the Lord. But in between Genesis chapter 12, where he builds an altar, and Genesis chapter 13, towards the end, where he builds the altar, there's a whole lot of things that happen in between that really convey to us the challenges, the difficulties of leaving the altar experience, or leaving the worshiping kind of mind frame. So let's step through it little by little and understand it. So what happens in verse 10? In Genesis chapter 12, verse 10, a famine occurs in the land, and so he leaves and he goes to Egypt. So remember back when we were doing the table of nations, or this is what we sometimes refer to it as, where we talked about how all the different nations came to be from the descendants of the three sons of Noah. And there we saw that Egypt was in a category of people who end up being, enemies to Israel. But you shouldn't always read it in that way, because time and time again, important points in the history of Israel, people turned to the land of Egypt for a way of sustaining them. And so during the time of famine, where do they go? They go to Egypt. During the time of Joseph, what happens during the time of famine? They come to Egypt. Where does Joseph and Mary, where do they go? When Herod is trying to kill all the children, they go to Egypt. So Egypt actually plays a really important role in regards to Christian and Jewish history. But keeping that as it is, let's try and ask ourselves, why did Abram feel the need to leave Egypt if God is the one who, feel the need to leave Canaan if God is the one who, in fact, called him to come and reside in Canaan? See, I think this kind of leads us to this idea that when things are going good, it's easy to trust in God. But as soon as difficulties or challenges arise, there's this tendency for us to act in a way that we feel is best, but not necessarily acting in a way that is in keeping with the way that God has called us to live. He leaves this place, and we notice that in the rest of the story, and as we get into chapter 13, nowhere during that time is Abram building altars to worship God in Egypt. So he has, in a metaphorical way, left the place of worship, but then also in a very physical way, he has left that place of worship and he has not reestablished it during this time. And during this time, you see that when he gets into this land, what does he say? His wife is beautiful, and so they're gonna like you, they're gonna take you, and they're gonna kill me. And so how does he try to deal with this situation? He doesn't turn to God and ask God for a plan. He doesn't pray on it. He doesn't fast on it. He doesn't sacrifice to God, hoping that he would understand a revelation or a vision. No, instead, he comes up with his own plan. And his plan is simply to say, hey, tell everyone you're my sister. Now, those who were with us in the Sevika Sangam meeting know that there is a partial truth to this. And in fact, yes, Sarah is the half-sister of Abram, but we're not going to get too much into that. The whole idea here is that he was scared to just say the truth. He was scared to trust completely in the way that God had established things, and he thought that it would be a wiser decision to do things his way. And so he goes from being trusting to being scheming. The Egyptians do exactly what he thought that they would do, but there was no backup plan to this. They come and they take Sarai, and then that's it. We have no clue as to what Abram's thinking was when he came up with this strategy. I think we have to also admit that there are times when things are going smooth and good. Trusting in God is easy, but then during times of difficulty, how quickly we turn to coming up with our own solutions for problems. And sometimes we try to fix things that God is not even fixing. And we try to understand things as problems when they're not even problems. Now, of course, I'm not talking about the current social situation that we find ourselves in. I think that's a problem that God has been calling us to for a long time. And perhaps in that situation too, we have been coming up with our own schemes and excuses. Now, before we quickly, say that, oh, this is such a wrong thing that Abram did, let's be honest and admit that there were immediate temporal blessings to what Abram chose to do. In the passage, it very clearly says that Pharaoh dealt well with Abram on account of Sarai. So the plan worked. It is a scheme. It is a plan of his own devices. It's not, we can say, God's plan, but it still works. It still happens to bear some sort of material blessings out of it. Now, we should also, if we're going to admit this, and I think it's important to admit this because this is part of the allure with doing things our own way, you do see, and you might very well experience a instant or quick gratification to the choices that you make. But in the long run, this kind of fruit, it always spoils. So you see that that Abram was definitely blessed, and he gets more things, but all of these things end up causing more problems for him later on. As you get into the first part of Genesis chapter 13, it very clearly says that Abram and Lot have so much stuff now that it's not possible for them to even live together. And so this whole idea of scheming, it starts off so good, but then it ends up dividing the family that he was trying to keep together. Right? He treated Lot as his own son. He brought Lot with him. And now it gets to a point where his own family is being divided because of these quote unquote blessings that he had received during his time in Egypt. Now, you may or may not have experienced this. I've seen this, having grown up in this diocese, of seeing the immense amount of wealth that can be accumulated over the course of one lifetime. But when God is not the center, when it's done in a scheming manner, very quickly the family just kind of goes in different directions. And so moving away from focusing on worshiping God, moving away from a worship mentality and a worship experience leads towards us trying to take things on our own terms, and eventually it'll lead to many kinds of rotten fruits in our life. If you look further, in Genesis chapter 13, verse 10, this mentality stays with them for such a long time. In fact, Lot ends up choosing, right? So you know the story, that there's no space, and so they decide to go their separate ways, and Abram gives Lot the option of choosing first. And Lot looks, and Genesis chapter 13 says, looks around and sees an area that's well watered, and it reminds him of Egypt. It reminds him of the place where he did things his way, or at least that was the motto of his family. And so it has generational effect too. So it's very important that as a worshiping community, as worshiping individuals, that we continue and persist in worship, because that's the way to stop us from trying to create our own plans and our own schemes for things. Another thing that happens is that when he moves away from God, he moves from an attitude of confidence to an attitude of fear. Like, remember, he left his home place, he left everything that he knew, and he just took his family and he went to a completely new place. He doesn't know who's going to be in the land of Canaan. It takes a great deal of confidence in God to be able to do that. But nonetheless, now we see that he is being completely controlled by his fears. Isaiah chapter 12, verse 2 says, "Surely God is my salvation. I will trust and I will not be afraid." Later on, "The Lord is my refuge. Whom shall I fear?" And there's countless other passages like this. In Mark chapter 4, verse 40, Jesus says, "Why are you afraid? Why have you still no faith?" Right? He says this to the fact that the disciples were in the boat and they were completely caught off guard by the storm. The whole time, if you go back and see the first 3 verses of Genesis chapter 12, God is saying, I will bless you. I will make your name great. I will make you a nation. And after all of that, when we get to Genesis chapter 12, verse 12, Abram's focus shifts off of the one who says, I will, to they will. He's talking about, and he's thinking only about what the Egyptians might do. Well, the Egyptians might see you, Sarah, and see that you're beautiful, and they might then kill me and just take you away. Well, why does this shift happen? But I think when we're focusing on God, as long as we stay centered on worshiping Christ, the only voice that matters is God's voice. But as soon as we move away from the altar, suddenly all the voices of the people around us somehow get more importance. We start to allow the voices of others to instill fear into us. What will other people think about me if I say that I'm a Christian at the workplace, or if I say that I am a follower of Jesus, or if I state my stance or my belief in my classroom? Right? Of course, nowadays that's not possible, but with our friends, there are times when we can take a stance, and sometimes when we don't take a stance because we're so scared of what they'll think and what they'll say. And we end up retreating into this life of isolation. The wife goes in one direction, the husband in another direction. Things might be going well for a reasonable period of time, but it's short-lived. And nonetheless, we're operating out of fear and not out of trust. The Bible does not say that we will never be scared. And the Bible doesn't say that you will never have times where you will struggle in your faith. I mean, this is not like to make it an idealistic kind of idea, but Jesus teaches to fight and wrestle against worry and to wrestle against anxiety. Right? He says all these things because that's the first step. If we can wrestle against anxiety and worry, by the time we get to the big things like fearing what other people say, we would have gotten so used to and so much accustomed to a rhythm of saying and trusting in God that when we hear the voices of people around us, we won't be discouraged and we won't take our eyes off of Christ. But this is another negative effect that happens to the life of Abram when he leaves the altar kind of lifestyle. He shifts from being confident to being fearful. A third thing that happens is there's another kind of shift that takes place. He goes from being a person who was about others to being a person about self. Say that you're my sister. Why? Not so that you'll be safe, Sarah, but so that I will be safe, so that Abram would be protected. The whole, like, we know this, and this is something that deserves to be said still in our culture. The husbands should put their wives first. Right? This is taught to us in the scripture. 1 Peter chapter 3 verse 7 says, "Husbands, in the same way, show consideration for your wives in your life together." Ephesians chapter 5 verse 28 says, "In the same way, husband, love your wives as you do your own bodies." Right? This idea of putting the other first, it's the same thing that Jesus did for us. He did not think about himself when he was going to the cross. He put himself behind those whom he loved, and he put us first. Right? In this way, we have to ask, where did this selfishness come from? Well, I think it came from the vacuum of not putting God first. Once God was taken out of the picture, once the worshiping and the thanksgiving slowed or ceased, what do you do with that space? Well, the natural tendency is to put yourself into that. And we start to focus on ourselves more than focusing on thanking God. I had a friend of mine in college. So the college I went to was it was an interesting, not the usual type of college experience. We were a bunch of 16-year-olds joining college together, and there was one kid in our class who was especially brilliant. He, at 16, aced the SATs, which is the examination that you take in order to, as an entrance exam for college. He was really smart, and everyone knew he was smart, and he wouldn't let you forget that he was smart. He had a tendency of kind of making big about himself and bragging. And so the first few days, as we're trying to know everyone in our class, because it's a fairly large batch of students, after a couple of days, we realized that there's one small kid in our class who we thought was, just like us, and then we realized that he's actually 14 years old. Here we were thinking, and here this guy, my friend, was thinking that he's super smart. because he's 16 and he aced the SATs. And then we all realize that no, there's actually someone 14 who is smarter than him. Well, needless to say that after that, whenever this younger kid was with us in a group, naturally this student, this friend of mine, he would just be humbler. He would have a tendency to keep his ego in check. The idea is this: when you're in the presence of someone greater, you have a tendency to bow your head and acknowledge your limitations. There's no room for self-centeredness when you're before God. And the best way to counter pride and selfishness is to come to God and to worship Him. If you think about it this way, the more you thank God, the less credit you take for yourself. But Abram, as he went away from God, the more he started to shift his attention towards himself. The fourth change that we notice is that God called him to be a blessing to the nations. And instead, we see in Genesis chapter 12, verse 17, that he ends up being a curse to Pharaoh and to the entire household of Pharaoh. In verse 17, it goes like this: "But the Lord afflicted Pharaoh and his house with great plagues because of Sarai, Abraham's wife." God just finished saying, you're going to be a blessing for all the nations. And then he went from being a blessing to being a curse. As he went away from worshiping God, as he went away from that altar lifestyle, he turns more and more into a burden for the people around him. Now, many people have a favorite biblical character, and I don't know if you have a favorite biblical prophet. If you do, it's probably one of the more dominant ones, like Elijah or Elisha. We were just talking about Elijah in our morning class today, or Isaiah or Samuel, Jeremiah. There's a number of great prophets. For some reason, my favorite ends up being Jonah. So I think Jonah is the more relatable one. He's the one who we all look like. And Jonah ran away from the will of God. Jonah was called to go and preach a message to the people of Nineveh, but instead he goes in the opposite direction, and he almost gets an entire boat of sailors who had nothing to do with the situation. He almost gets them entirely killed. Right? The storm was getting to the point where these professional sailors were getting scared. And Jonah then finally realizes, he is the one who has brought this curse upon them. How does Jonah get back onto the right path? Well, you read Jonah chapter 2. Jonah chapter 2 is this entire prayer of Jonah while he's in the belly of the fish. And he says this: "But I, with the voice of thanksgiving, will sacrifice to you. What I have vowed, I will pay. Deliverance belongs to the Lord." But what he does here is he blesses God, he thanks God, he worships God. And that becomes the experience that puts him back on the right path towards restoration, towards being a blessing. What do we do? What do we do in the middle of our week when we're away from this kind of an altar experience? Are we establishing altars wherever we go? Is every room in our house a place where we can worship God? If so, I think it will help us to not try to take matters into our own hands. To a degree, maybe the violence that we see around us is humanity taking matters into their own hands because they're so frustrated that things aren't going the way that they should. And maybe they're frustrated because Christians haven't been saying what that needed to be said in all of these years. When we establish a lifestyle of being in the altar spaces, we move away from doubt and fear, and we move back into a confident trust in God. This will enable us to have a kind of perseverance, to know that even if results are slow, that God is the one who will bring everything to fruition. If we can trust in God and have that resilience, we won't get discouraged when there is a famine in our lives, and we will be able to lean on him more wholeheartedly. Establishing this kind of altar lifestyle will shift us away from being selfish and will help us to realize that we are not the center of the world. Our needs are secondary to the needs of those around us. Yes, we have to take care of ourselves, of course. I've used this example before. Lifeguards are taught this at all costs, that you have, if you're trying to rescue a person, and if you are then in danger, you have to take care of yourself, because if you don't take care of yourself, how can you take care of the other? Yes, so there is that understanding of being able to critique ourselves, but not to be selfish about ourselves. The reason we critique ourselves is so that we can help others. The reason we as Christians ought to reflect and come to God in times of confession and repentance is so that we can go out and say, I forgive you, when others in the world are doing wrong. So we can go and give an experience of repentance to others, so that we can be a blessing to others. And then finally, it's this last one. We are called to be a blessing and not to be a curse. You know, one of the things that came out of this whole experience of being in Egypt is Hagar. But when you get to Genesis chapter 16, and we'll get there eventually, but Genesis chapter 16 very clearly says that Hagar was an Egyptian. So she was someone who they would have brought and acquired while they were there in Egypt. And just imagine now for a moment how different human history would have been if Abram just stayed put, if he trusted in God. He built an altar, he called on the name of God, trust that God would take care of him. If he had not gone into Egypt, he wouldn't have brought Hagar, they wouldn't have had Ishmael, they wouldn't have tried to take matters into their own hands, even in that regard of having offspring. And so many other stories in human history would have been changed afterwards. Nonetheless, what happened has happened. What will we do now? Will we be a blessing to those around us? Don't leave the altar that God is asking you and calling you to build where you are right now. In fact, the call of God is to go around and build altars all over the place. The New Testament concept of an altar is not the temple, it's not the synagogue, and it's not even the church. It's wherever the Holy Spirit is, right? Because your body is the temple of God. And so we are altars wherever we go, as long as we're a worshiping community. And if we can do this, we can bring others into an atmosphere, a mindset, a lifestyle of worship, and we can avoid all of these pitfalls that we saw Abram do in his life. So may the good Lord strengthen us to learn from Abram, to be able to put into practice the good things that God has called us to do, and that we would be a worshiping community now and always. Amen.